The wind howled through the deserted park, carrying a bitter chill that cut through the trees like unseen blades. Snow blanketed the ground, untouched except for the occasional swirl of frost kicked up by the relentless gusts. It was the kind of night where even the most resilient creatures sought shelter, yet something unnatural disturbed the stillness. As he walked along the narrow path, his boots crunching against the frozen earth, a dark shape caught his eye near the base of a towering tree. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a pile of snow-covered debris, but as he stepped closer, a sickening realization settled in his gut. A dog, motionless, its fur stiff with frost, was tied to the tree, its leash pulled taut as if it had fought desperately to escape. His heart pounded as he crouched down, his breath fogging the freezing air. The dog, a German shepherd, shivered uncontrollably, its body frail and eyes wide with something between fear and exhaustion. How long had it been out here? Who would leave an animal like this, abandoned in such brutal conditions? He scanned the area, searching for any sign of movement, any clue as to who had done this, but the park was empty, eerily silent. The weight of the moment settled heavily on his chest. He knew he couldn't just walk away. This dog wasn't just cold. It was on the verge of death. Without thinking, he reached out, fingers brushing against its icy fur. The German shepherd flinched but didn't resist, too weak to protest. He had no idea what he was about to get himself into, but one thing was certain. He wasn't leaving without this dog. The night was unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that made every small sound feel magnified. The distant hum of the city had faded long ago, leaving only the occasional rustle of brittle branches and the eerie whistle of the wind cutting through the empty park. The streetlights nearby flickered weakly, casting long, distorted shadows across the snow, as if the darkness itself was shifting, watching. He pulled his coat tighter around himself, but the cold had already settled deep into his bones. The air smelled of frozen earth and something stale, something unnatural, making his stomach tighten with unease. There was no reason for anyone to be out here this late, yet the presence of the abandoned dog suggested otherwise. Someone had been here recently, and whoever it was had left this poor creature to die. A sudden gust of wind sent a shiver down his spine, but it wasn't just the cold. There was something deeply unsettling about the way the trees loomed overhead, their skeletal branches creaking as if whispering secrets to one another. His breath came out in visible puffs, merging with the frost-laced air before disappearing into the darkness. He glanced around again, half expecting to see a figure standing just beyond the tree line, watching. But there was nothing, only shadows stretching in unnatural shapes, the snow-covered ground eerily undisturbed aside from his own footprints. The German shepherd let out a faint whimper, snapping him back to reality. He had to get them both out of here. Yet, as he reached for the leash, an unsettling thought gnawed at the back of his mind. If someone had left this dog here, alone and defenseless, were they really gone? Or were they still out there, hiding in the darkness, waiting? Ethan had never been the kind of person to ignore someone in need, especially not an animal left to suffer in the cold. Growing up, he'd always felt a strong connection to dogs, maybe because they were the only ones who had ever truly been there for him. His childhood had been far from easy. An absent father, a mother working late shifts, and a house that never quite felt like home. But there was one constant. Max, his old German shepherd, who had been his best friend through it all. Losing Max years ago had left a hole in his heart, one he never really filled. Maybe that was why, when he saw the trembling dog tied to that tree, he couldn't just walk away. It felt too familiar, too personal, like a cruel déjà vu he wasn't prepared for. As he knelt beside the shivering shepherd, he felt the dog's ribs beneath its thick fur, its body weak from exhaustion. The way it looked up at him, unsure, yet desperate for kindness, made his chest tighten. Who could do this? Who could leave a living creature to freeze? Ethan's jaw clenched as he scanned the area again, his instincts telling him something wasn't right. The park was too quiet, the air too still. His fingers fumbled as he reached for his pocket knife to cut the frayed rope digging into the dog's neck. As he did, a strange sensation prickled at the back of his neck, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. Slowly, he turned his head, scanning the darkened tree line. Nothing, just shadows stretching against the snow. Yet the unease refused to leave him. The dog whimpered again, urging him to move. He shook off the feeling, but a chilling thought crept into his mind. If someone had abandoned this dog out here, had they really just left? Or were they still lurking nearby, waiting for something or someone? Ethan didn't waste another second. With one swift motion, he sliced through the frayed rope, freeing the trembling dog. The shepherd hesitated for a moment before pressing its cold, wet nose against Ethan's hand, as if silently pleading for help. He could feel the rapid rise and fall of the dog's ribs, the sheer exhaustion in its body. Ethan wrapped his coat around the animal, shielding it from the bitter cold. His breath hung in the air, curling in the eerie silence of the empty park. Something still felt off. The sensation of being watched hadn't faded, and no matter how many times he looked over his shoulder, the unease clung to him like a shadow. He needed to get out of there. Just as he stood, guiding the dog with him, a sound split through the quiet, a crunch, a deliberate step. Ethan's muscles tensed. His heart pounded in his ears as his eyes darted toward the source. Nothing, but he knew he wasn't imagining it. The dog knew it too. Its ears perked up, body rigid, eyes locked onto the darkness between the trees. A low growl rumbled from its throat. Ethan's stomach twisted. Someone was there, but why weren't they revealing themselves? He felt the urge to call out, to demand whoever was lurking to show themselves. But something inside him, some primal instinct, screamed at him to stay quiet. Instead, he tightened his grip on the dog and took a slow, careful step backward. Then another. A sudden gust of wind howled through the trees, sending a shower of brittle leaves cascading around him. The momentary distraction was enough to jolt him into action. He turned sharply and walked, then jogged, then ran. The dog kept pace beside him, stumbling slightly, weak but determined. The exit to the park wasn't far, just past the playground, through the old iron gate. If they could just make it there, they'd be safe. But the further they ran, the heavier the air became, like the weight of something unseen pressing down on them. Then, just as they neared the gate, another sound. This one was worse than footsteps. A whisper. It was faint, barely audible, but undeniably there. Ethan stopped cold. His pulse thundered. The dog whined, pressing against his leg. He turned his head ever so slightly, his eyes scanning the tree line again. The whisper came again, closer this time, curling through the frigid air like smoke. His fingers dug into the dog's fur as he forced himself to move, to push forward. His hand slammed against the rusted iron gate, but the moment he did, something or someone moved in the shadows. The figure. It was too dark to make out details, but the silhouette was unmistakable. Someone was standing there, watching. Ethan's breath hitched. He didn't wait to find out who or what it was. He shoved the gate open, practically stumbling through with the dog. He slammed it shut behind him, his chest heaving. The dog whimpered, pressing close to his leg, but it never took its eyes off the trees. Ethan followed its gaze, but the figure was gone, vanished as if it had never been there at all. His skin crawled. He had to get home. Now, the walk back to his apartment was a blur. Every noise, every flickering streetlight, every rustling leaf felt like a warning. By the time he reached his door, he was drenched in cold sweat. He fumbled with his keys, heart hammering as he finally shoved the door open and locked it behind him. The dog slumped onto the floor, too exhausted to move. Ethan knelt beside it, running a hand over its fur. "You're safe now," he murmured, more for himself than the dog. But even as he said it, he wasn't sure if it was true. That feeling, that horrible, suffocating sensation of being watched, hadn't left. He forced himself to take deep breaths, to shake it off. Maybe it was paranoia. Maybe he had spooked himself. But as he reached for his phone to call animal services, a notification popped up. His stomach dropped. A new message. Unknown number. He hesitated before opening it. For words glared back at him, sending ice through his veins. "I saw what you did." Ethan's grip tightened around the phone. His mind raced. Who? What did they want? His hands trembled as he typed a response. "Who is this?" He waited, staring at the screen, but no reply came. Just silence. The room felt impossibly still, the air thick with tension. The dog stirred beside him, letting out a soft whimper. Then his phone vibrated again. Another message. "You shouldn't have taken it." His breath hitched. His eyes darted to the dog, curled up on the floor. His pulse roared in his ears. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone had left the dog there on purpose. Someone had been watching him, and now they wanted him to know. But the worst part wasn't the messages. It was what came next. A knock at the door. A single, deliberate knock that sent a shudder through his entire body. His fingers clenched around his phone as he slowly turned his head toward the entrance. Whoever was on the other side wasn't just some random person. They had followed him. They knew where he lived, and they weren't going to leave until he answered. Ethan's breath came in short, uneven gasps as he stared at the door. The knock had been firm, deliberate, not the kind that came from a neighbor needing sugar or a lost delivery driver. It was slow, precise, each strike against the wood sending a pulse of dread through his veins. The dog, curled up beside him, lifted its head, ears twitching. A low growl rumbled from its throat. Ethan swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around his phone. Seconds stretched into eternity. His mind raced through possibilities. Could it be the person who had tied the dog to the tree? The one who had been watching him? His muscles tensed as he slowly crept toward the door. He didn't dare look through the peephole. Some primal part of him refused to see what stood on the other side. Another knock, this time softer, almost patient. Ethan's fingers hovered over the lock, but he stopped himself. What was he doing? Opening the door was the last thing he should do. He needed to call someone. The police? But what would he even say? That he found a dog in the woods? Got a creepy message? And now someone was knocking? It sounded insane. His phone buzzed again. A new message. "Open the door, Ethan." His blood ran cold. They knew his name. He staggered back, nearly tripping over the dog. The room felt too small, the air too thick. His pulse pounded in his ears. His hands shook as he typed back. "Who are you?" The reply came instantly. "You took something that wasn't yours." Ethan's gaze darted to the dog. It was watching him, its deep brown eyes locked onto his. His skin prickled. He didn't understand. It was just a dog. A helpless, freezing animal left for dead. Who could possibly care this much? The knock came again, louder this time, more forceful. The dog let out a sharp bark, jumping to its feet. Ethan backed away, his mind screaming for him to move, to do something. But then, silence. No more knocks. No more messages. The eerie stillness stretched for too long. Ethan strained his ears, waiting. Then, in the suffocating quiet, he heard it. A sound that made his stomach turn. Scraping. Something was moving against his door. Not knocking. Not pounding. Dragging. His throat tightened as he imagined fingernails. Or worse, something sharper, trailing along the wood. The dog barked again, but this time it wasn't aggressive. It was nervous, hesitant. Ethan forced himself to inch forward. His breath came shallow, his body locked in place by an invisible force of dread. He pressed his ear against the door. Silence. Then, 3 words, whispered so faintly he almost didn't hear them. "Let go." Ethan's body jerked backward, his heart slamming against his ribs. His hands fumbled for the deadbolt, twisting it with shaking fingers. He wasn't taking any chances. He grabbed a chair, shoving it under the handle for good measure. His pulse refused to slow. The dog was pacing now, uneasy. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, trying to steady his thoughts. Maybe this was some elaborate prank. Maybe he was overreacting. But the messages, the way they knew his name, his phone buzzed again. "You made a mistake, Ethan." His vision blurred. His chest felt tight. He tried to type back, But before he could, his apartment went dark. The lights flickered once, then again. Then they died completely. The dog whimpered. Ethan's breath hitched. The entire building was silent. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint buzz of the heater, all gone. His phone screen was the only source of light now, casting an eerie glow over the room. He turned in slow circles, scanning every shadowed corner. His fingers hovered over his flashlight app. But before he could turn it on, something caught his eye. The peephole. It wasn't dark anymore. A single, glowing red light peered through from the other side. Watching, waiting. Ethan's stomach lurched. His breath turned to ice. He stumbled backward, his body screaming at him to run, to hide. But where? There was nowhere to go. Then the scratching started again. This time lower, closer to the floor, like something was trying to get in. Ethan's heart pounded as he staggered back. His gaze locked on the glowing red light peering through the peephole. His breath came in ragged gasps, his mind screaming at him to run, to hide, to do anything. But his body refused to move. The dog let out a low, trembling whine, pressing itself against his legs. The scratching at the door didn't stop. It grew more frantic, more desperate. Then, a new sound joined it. Something wet, something alive. A slithering noise, like flesh dragging against the wood. Ethan clenched his fists, willing himself to act. This was real. This wasn't paranoia or exhaustion playing tricks on him. Something was outside that door and it wanted in. His fingers fumbled for his phone, shaking so violently he almost dropped it. He turned on the flashlight, its beams slicing through the darkness of his apartment. Every shadow felt alive. Every dark corner a potential hiding place for whatever was on the other side of that door. A loud thud made him jump. Something heavy had slammed against the door, rattling the frame. The dog barked wildly, its fur standing on end. Ethan swallowed the bile rising in his throat. He had to get out. Now, but how? The door was no longer an option. The only way out was the window, but he was 3 stories up. If he climbed down, would he make it? Another thud, this time harder. The door frame splintered slightly. Ethan's stomach twisted. It wasn't going to hold much longer. He had no choice. He grabbed the dog's collar, yanking it toward the window. But as he turned, his phone screen lit up with a final message. Too late, Ethan. A shiver tore through him. He whipped his head toward the door just as the lock burst apart with a deafening crack. The door swung open. Slowly, too slowly, as if whatever was on the other side wanted him to see. The hallway beyond should have been empty. It should have been the same dimly lit corridor he walked through every day. But it wasn't. It was pitch black. Not the kind of darkness caused by a power outage. This was something deeper, something unnatural. It stretched endlessly, swallowing the light from his phone. His chest constricted, panic clawing at his lungs. He took an involuntary step back. But it didn't matter, because something stepped forward. It wasn't human. Not entirely. The shape was wrong, its limbs too long, its movements too smooth. The red glow from the peephole was now its eyes. 2 burning embers that locked onto Ethan with a chilling, knowing stare. The air in the apartment turned ice cold. Ethan tried to scream, but no sound came out. The dog barked again, but it wasn't a bark of warning. It was calling to it, a greeting. Ethan's stomach dropped as the realization hit him. The dog wasn't afraid. It wasn't trying to protect him. It had led him here. He stumbled backward, his legs trembling beneath him. The thing in the doorway didn't lunge. It didn't need to. It simply raised one elongated hand and pointed at him. A silent command. And Ethan felt it. A pull. A force stronger than fear, stronger than logic. It wrapped around his mind like a noose, tightening with each passing second. His vision blurred. His thoughts twisted. The darkness wasn't just around him. It was inside him. His body moved on its own. One step forward, then another. The dog trotted ahead, its tail wagging. It had always belonged to it. Ethan reached the doorway, the void stretching before him, endless and waiting. His fingers brushed the frame, the last solid thing tethering him to reality. His heartbeat slowed. The thing tilted its head, those burning eyes unblinking, and then smiled. Not with a mouth, not in any way a human should smile. But Ethan felt it, a knowing grin carved into his soul, welcoming him home. The last thing he saw before stepping into the darkness was his own reflection in its eyes, twisted, stretched, and grinning back. Then, the door slammed shut behind him. The apartment was silent. The broken door hung ajar, the cold air seeping in like an unwelcome guest. But Ethan was gone. No trace of him remained, no footprints, no belongings left in haste. Just the faint scent of something old, something rotten, lingering in the air. The dog sat by the doorway, tail still, eyes staring into the empty hallway. It let out a soft whimper, then trotted away, vanishing into the shadows as if it had never been there at all. Days passed, then weeks. The landlord eventually came to check on the missing tenant, but the apartment was untouched, as if Ethan had never moved in. His name disappeared from the lease, his existence wiped clean. Neighbors swore they remembered someone living there, but details slipped through their minds like water through cupped hands. Had there even been a man named Ethan? But some things didn't fade so easily. At night, new tenants reported hearing scratching at the door, a soft, rhythmic tapping that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. Some claimed to see a pair of glowing red eyes through the peephole, watching, waiting. And sometimes, just before dawn, the faintest whisper would creep through the walls. A voice, distant yet familiar, pleading with whoever was listening. Don't open the door. But curiosity is a dangerous thing, and some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. If you were in Ethan's place, what would you have done? Would you have ignored the strange sounds? Or would you have opened the door to see what was really waiting on the other side? Some mysteries are better left unsolved. But do you think Ethan ever truly left? Or is he still trapped, lingering in that apartment, waiting for someone else to hear his whispers? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think really happened? And if you enjoyed this chilling tale, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more stories that will keep you up at night. Turn on notifications so you never miss another terrifying mystery. Because sometimes, the scariest stories are the ones that feel just a little too real. Stay curious, but be careful what doors you open.